Thank you, Beth, for alerting us to a request for a voice back in 1938. Now, we didn't get very far. I imagine those fellows who shuffled into the Prime Minister's office would have been lucky to get a cup of tea before they were shuffled out the other door. But there have been lots of voices since then. That's what I want to tell you about, and I hope this will give you some ammunition for persuading the doubtful that voices can work. We've got 6 or 7 voices we've had, and they've all come to sticky ends, as I will demonstrate. Let's start with Whitlam's time. He created in 1973 the National Aboriginal Consultative Committee from all over Australia except Tasmania. Tasmania was rejected because, quote, there aren't any Aboriginal people there, unquote, so they didn't get a representation. But there were about 40 people who flew to Canberra and began their first consultations. They had to fight Senator Kavanagh, who was a pretty tough opponent. And of course, all voices which come into existence are supposed to just give mild-mannered advice to the minister, but they hardly ever do. By the end of it, in 1976, Senator Kavanagh says, there are a group of part Aboriginals who thought their main function was to criticise. They were prepared to brand as racist those who didn't agree with them in order to justify their existence, but they couldn't put forward sound principles of their own for future action. They've got no real desire to prove that a lot of Aboriginals, they're just a bunch of half-caste themselves. That's the NAC 1973. NACC, I beg your pardon. It was already coming to grief in the end of Whitlam's time. So Mr. Fraser, right, we'll work that and we'll call it the National Aboriginal Conference. So elected all over again. That went well. But unfortunately, they got a bit stroppy too, particularly under Rob Riley. Remember Uncle Rob? Very brave man. Initially, there were some naive people there. I mean, old Lyle Munro, who was, I think he must have been on the executive committee, he said, we demand 5% of the GNP. You know, Charlie Perkins saying this is ludicrous. Every blackfellow in Australia would need to turn up with a wheelbarrow outside the office for his share. But things steadied down a bit. They got more sensible and became more and more radical. And that was not at all popular with the government. Rob Riley sent emissaries across to the UN who were bagging the government. That's not what we intended for voices to do. They're supposed to just give us advice. The minister advice, and not go running off to the opposition to lobby them when the government isn't heeding our advice. That didn't get down too well. It was too much for Hawke. It was too much for Fraser, even in his time. He said, we have a Makarrata, but not a treaty. It wasn't altogether clear what the difference was. While people like Nugget Coombs, I actually was on his committee for a while, were pushing for an Aboriginal treaty. Oh, by the way, what arrogance. I shudder to think of that. Nugget and all his mates, including me, they didn't once consider whether they should consult any Aboriginal people. Can you believe it? Yeah, that's another story, really. But it was when Fraser left, Hawke didn't like the way that the Rob Riley was bagging the government in public, so that was the end of that. End of the NAC. Aboriginal Development Commission. Well, that looked promising because we've got initially a good minister, seemed to be a good minister, Clyde Holding. Charlie Perkins was going to head it up, and working with Tony Ayres, a brilliant administrator who later went on to head up the Department of Defence. Really talented. And those three were like that. They got on really, really well. We're going to cook up an act here which will enable real power, not just advisory power, but real power to buy, to use the land fund, to use the capital fund and buy properties Not so much advice, that'll come from the DAA, but there'll be you certainly will be able to. We're going to give you an act that's so strong, it was described by its critics as you could drive a bulldozer through its provisions. If the ADC wanted Aboriginal Development Commission, wanted to set up an office on the moon, they could do so. And even if the DAA or the government said you can't, they're protected by the Charter. The Charter actually said if the government wants to get rid of the head of the ADC, reasons has to be put into Parliament, laid in the Parliament for a fortnight before you can even act upon it. Perkins told me that he got very unpopular towards the end of that time. He was wheeled into Fraser's office where all the mandarins sitting around here and said, Charlie, we can't get rid of you, but we'll offer you anything at all if you're gone by the end of the year. Oh, I'm not going anywhere, Mr. Fraser. Well, that's asking for trouble, wasn't it? Now, there's something in particular here I want to draw your attention to, the preamble of the bill, the ADC Act. This development of this Act is to further the economic and social development of the people of the Aboriginal race of Australia and their descendants, in particular a recognition of past dispossession and dispersal of such people, and to establish a capital fund with the object of promoting their development, self-management and self-sufficiency. Well, you can't rule from beyond the grave. You can pass any act you like, but if the government doesn't want to give you any money, well, you've had it. That's what happened. They were underfunded, understaffed in the end. So in the end of that, those noble words there, weren't they? Noble words about dispossession, dispersal of such people. No, to hell with it. 5 years later, the ADC Act, with such power and ambition that it hit the cutting room floor as well. ATSIC. Again, it's an initiative of Hawke, was to try and design and bring in all the functions of the DAA and the ADC, so many functions which agencies were fulfilling in various government departments, all together to rationalise Aboriginal delivery service through their own decision-making processes. It was a bold initiative, but by this time, Jerry Hand had his own group of advisors, which didn't include many of the people on the ATSIC board. They fell into disagreement in a pretty short time. Senator Vanstone, Minister for Aboriginal Affairs for a while, did not like the direction they were taking. Now, of course, people can't really continue for very long if you have a minister dead against you, because in the end, ministers and governments hold the trumps. Of course, in the end of it, Jeff Clark and Sugar Ray Robinson, two people I would not leave in my shookyard overnight, they were running ATSIC. But of course, ladies and gentlemen, if we got rid of every organisation that had bad leadership, what would we have left in Australia? Because leadership gets better again. The ADC, which had begun with such promises in 2005. Incidentally, an interesting article by Larissa Behrendt on the demise of that. She said, the ATSIC was able to maintain a focus on the rights agenda in a period where federal government policy was one of practical reconciliation. ATSIC's position was always that the recognition and enjoyment of rights was also required if any real, meaningful and sustainable progress was to be attained. The rights agenda advocated by ATSIC was a position that directly opposed the federal government, but ATSIC was able to continue to focus on broader structural and long-term rights issues. They did a hell of a lot of good work, actually, because it ended in the end under a cloud, but they've done some wonderful work, particularly in service deliveries, sensible service deliveries in that time. There was a review undertaken by Jackie Huggins and two other members of Parliament. The wise Jackie saw what was happening already, this is 2004, and she said, look, don't abolish ATSIC, it's in a bad state at the moment. Increase your regional powers and decision-making. And of course, that's the direction that Aboriginal administration and Aboriginal thought at the top level has been going ever since, since 2000. that is regional administration. Forget about Canberra. Do deals locally. This is where our own integrity has survived. If we want to do deals with anybody, we're going to deal with the state government. And that's what the review of ATSIC actually suggested. But did it happen? No. Council of Aboriginal Reconciliation. That was one that did have a life, to 1990 to 1999, a 10-year life that was given. And I was talking, actually, I did an interview with Senator Margaret Reynolds, and she pointed out to me, in the course of this interesting interview, she said, yeah, you know, of course, we were a voice. And I thought, yeah, of course you were. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that before. We're a very important voice. 10 years we worked together to get our final ideas straight. Look at this magnificent statement. As we walk the journey of healing, one part of the nation apologises and expresses its sorrow and sincere regret for the injustices of the past, so the other part accepts the apologies and forgives. How on earth did they get that through the communities? And what happened to it? 6 carefully worked out proposals. John Howard says, we'll take half of number 5, thanks, which is practical reconciliation, which of course we've all been doing all this time anyway. All that work by the Reconciliation Council, that's what happens. Anyone who's frightened that the voice is going to lead demands for free parking for blackfellas, that's what happened to 10 years' work. 10 years' work, Howard says, no, to hell with it. No, not having that. Good, fine. And no, there were some other things, so we could talk about the Barunga statement on the way that fell in a heap, and the social justice package, which never got off the ground properly either, closing the gap. But you can see, if you want to know the historical continuity to pass on to those who need convincing, we've had lots and lots of voices, and they've all been abolishable. And when you can abolish them, that's what happens. Thanks.